I'm Christian Wolmar, and welcome to episode 10 of Calling All Stations, the podcast that keeps you up to date with the transport issues in the news. And with me is Mark Walker of Cogitamus. We've got quite a lot to discuss today, Mark, haven't we?
As ever, Christian, we have a number of big issues that have developed over recent days. We're going to look at the UK government's announcement on rescheduling work on the construction of the high-speed rail line HS2. We're also going to take a look at bus reform proposals and how the legislation works in Great Britain to regulate or not the bus industry at present. There are also big developments in a recovering post-pandemic civil aviation sector. And then finally, we'll look at what happened or perhaps didn't happen in the UK Chancellor of the Exchequer's budget in relation to fuel duty.
Right, well, let's start with HS2, Mark. And it's difficult to say this is not just, difficult not to use rude words actually, but it starts with cluster. I just, I've always been an opponent of this. But I wouldn't wish what's happening on my worst enemy, actually, because it's being cut kind of in every possible way. It's been delayed. It's now probably not going to, to be honest, I'm 73, Mark. I'm not going to travel on this, I don't think ever, because they're talking of 2040, 2045. I'll be in my 90s.
You'll go on forever and ever.
I hope
I'm
so.
Sure.
But, it's touch and go whether I'll get on that first train. And so I think, first of all, I want to explain a little bit about where I feel it's gone wrong. This is a project that, has been on the go since 2009. Right, that's 14 years. And now it seems to be about another 10 to 12 years before we're going to see any rail travel on it at all. So 35 years of gestation of the project. And I think the mistakes were made right from the beginning. I think there was never any real understanding of what this project was for. What was its unique selling point? I wrote a letter in the Times just a few days ago, basically saying, well, it didn't have a unique selling point, and now it doesn't seem to have a selling point at all. And they started off saying, high-speed rail, we're going to buzz you to Birmingham and Manchester very quickly. And then they realised that wasn't really a selling point. So then they decided that it was capacity, which indeed it will increase capacity, but only on a kind of very small number of kind of journeys. And then they get into the idea, this is a levelling up project and we'll bring the north closer to the south. And then now we seem to be in a situation where they're basically saying, well, we can't stop now. We've got all these bits of embankment and bits of tunnel dug in the Chilterns, and we can't leave that for the rats. So it leaves the project in a bit of a mess.
I know you've always been a sceptic, really, about HS2. I probably put myself with doubts and criticisms, but broadly on the other side of the argument, that I've always seen it as something which is essentially good. And perhaps at the very beginning, my view was quite a simplistic one, that if a government was prepared to spend billions of pounds on a rail improvement in Great Britain, then we ought to just take it and almost worry later about what the purpose was. Because for so many decades, the railways were starved of investment. And here at the end of the 2010s, the noughties actually, and into the 2010s, was this huge vote of confidence in rail as a transport mode. So I always took some comfort from that. But I'd have to agree with you that the case has never been overwhelmingly and convincingly made in this country for the project by successive governments of different political persuasions to the extent that what should be something that we take enormous national pride in is kind of, it's permanently open season, really, isn't it?
It's shrouded in embarrassment instead. Yes,
and I find that baffling. I find as a layperson, in a sense, why the numbers are always wrong, even though the numbers are calculated by clever people and checked by other clever people, and maybe even a third layer of clever people, but the numbers always seem to be wrong. And I think that what that does is it provides the ammunition always to the skeptics to say, no, let's not do it. Let's not finish it completely. Let's lop pieces off of it, which seems to be almost the process of salami slicing that's going on, having lost the eastern leg to Leeds, and now the curtailment, at least in delivery, as far as crew, and incredibly, curtailment between Old Oak Common and London Euston, even though I walked past Euston the other day and it's a building
it's
site.
A wasteland. I take your points, but what we're left with, Mark, and this is what I'm really worried about, is another line between not even Euston, as you say, Old Oak Common and Birmingham, and there are even some doubts about whether they're going to continue with the junction at this stage, whether they're going to continue with the junction up to Handsacre, then that allows them to connect back onto the West Coast main line. They might not even include that in the kind of early sections. So look, I take your point. It's great that the railways are getting all this investment rather than the roads or whatever. But to counter that point, I would say this. I remember talking in the early days to a great supporter of the scheme, Jim Steer, who actually really worked behind the scenes with Green Gauge 21, kind of pushing this. Yes, and I remember him saying, I said, well, what about fares? What are the fares going to be? He said, oh, no, the fares will be the same. I said, well, what about taking investment away from the rest of the rail industry? He said, no. It is separate. It's absolutely separate. And the supporters still argue this. I mean, when I get criticised on Twitter for being against it, they say, oh, this is just money that will otherwise not be spent, and it's extra. Neither of these arguments actually stand up. I mean, the fares clearly are going to be higher than on the existing network. They already are on HS1. There's a £3 premium for every journey.
I'd actually challenge that, Christian, because as you say, it's a very long way from opening, and any government can create any fares policy strategy on pricing that it wishes to, depending on the balance it chooses to strike between fare-paying income and taxpayer support for a public transport system. So I don't think it automatically follows that the fares will be high.
Okay, but I think it's very unlikely that the Treasury, after spending 100 billion or whatever it's going to be, would then say, oh no, you can have nice cheap fares on this line. I know in France, actually, they have a brilliant system whereby they created two competing services. So you have the main kind of TGV service and they have Ouigo, which actually is kind of a budget railway using sort of different trains and cramming you in a bit more and not allowing you to take so much luggage and so on, much cheaper. So it is feasible, but I can't see us having the imagination to do that. And the second point that Jim Steer, I think, are made about the fact that it's not pinching money off the rest of the railways. I think you can't argue with, Mark. I challenge you to argue against that, because it is clear that politically, when the people see all this money going on the railways, and then they get asked to fund kind of other, what I would say, more worthwhile schemes, they will say, oh, well, look, there's all this money going on the railways. I mean, the railways, it was admitted in Parliament the other day that it's £120 million a week. It's £6 billion a year is being spent on building this line that, quite a lot of us are never going to get a chance to ride on. And a lot of people in Wales, in East Anglia, in Cornwall, in all sorts of places are not going to benefit from it all.
And I think I would far from argue for salami slicing the route, I'd argue for a bigger HS2, and I'd actually argue for more HS2. And in fact, one of my hopes from the Union Connectivity Review was that the case might have been made actually to build HS2 in time all the way to Scotland and for other extensions from it, as indeed happened with the TGV network in France, because I'm sure I'm right in saying that once the first TGV line opened and the scepticism was overcome, communities started to clamour to be part of the TGV network.
Yes, Mark, but one has to think the price of this. I mean, the price per mile in France is something like I think 40 million, and the price per mile in the UK seems about 5 times that or something. And
that's partly because of the system that we have for objectors, so that so much of it has to go into very expensive tunnels instead of going up and down.
Well, they could have said no to that. They could have, and that was my other criticism of the whole project. That it's never had a proper project manager, within the government. I think a project manager has to be a kind of state actor, as it were, kind of saying, right, we're going to do this and we're going to push this through. And actually, these objections are spurious. I think we've never had that. And just as a last point, go on the HS2 website and look up the minutes of the board meetings, right? And you'll find that they basically, beyond saying, we've had a very nice meeting and welcome to so-and-so, they redact all the kind of detailed information that you might want to kind of find out about it. There's whole sections that are completely redacted, so you don't even know what the sections are about.
Well, that's a really interesting point, and I'm sure some of our listeners will be doing that very thing right now. People are always amazed when I point out that there are something like 4 to 5 times as many journeys made by bus in this country per year as there are by train. And the bus is an incredibly important part of our transport system. But there are some ideas around for reform, Christian.
Yes, I must say that Labour, when it was in power, for between 1997 and 2010, really missed out on bus reform. I mean, the bus system that was created after deregulation and selling off the National Bus Company in the mid-80s was really a mess. And yet, over the period of 13 years of their rule, they introduced sort of legislation, but it was so difficult to get around how to do it that none of the bus areas that they hoped would sort of renationalise or end up franchising managed to do it. And oddly enough, it's been the Tories who've actually passed legislation that allowed the areas, like Manchester being the first one, to take over their buses and franchise them out, which seems a great sensible compromise between the public and the private sectors. And now Louise Haigh, who is Labour's transport spokesperson, has rightly got in on the act, and in a little reported visit up to Newcastle, a speech there, she said that bus reform is going to be high on their agenda, and that apparently they want to pretty much reverse the idea that only private companies can run buses, and they're going to encourage local authorities to recreate local bus services and quite possibly run them themselves. Now, you might remember all this, Mark, but in the mid-1980s, as I mentioned, the bus companies were broken up and the municipal bus companies were mostly taken over by the big companies like Stagecoach and Arriva. And of course, what started off as, hot foot competition, where I remember that Nicholas Ridley, the transport secretary at the time, said, we want, owner drivers who are going to compete with each other on different bus routes and race around. And we had this terrible period where there were awful buses kind of running everywhere and so on. And that all settled down to essentially monopolies in most places, or duopolies at best in some. So and some municipal bus companies survived, I think, didn't they?
There are a handful in across the country. I mean, but some of them actually quite large operations now, such as Lothian buses in Scotland and Cardiff Bus in the city of the same name, and Reading is regarded as a very successful operator. I could list them all, but
right. But they have. But what's interesting, of course, is that often these are the most successful. But they win awards in bus in bus kind of.
They tend to have modern fleets, increasingly electric vehicles, and to the extent that they're allowed to within the constraints of the law, they have a view about integration with other transport modes.
Yes, but you're not quite allowed to do that, are you?
No. Yes, you have to be. All of these municipally owned companies have to operate as if they were private companies at arm's length from the local authorities.
And you have this ridiculous situation where you might have two different bus apps and two different cards to use the local buses and all this stuff. And now hopefully Louis Haig's kind of reforms would do away with that. Now, of course, there is always a question mark over these sort of political statements, which is money. One of the real ways in which the bus companies have been cut back is through lack of subsidy, and the lack of subsidy has been because local authorities are squeezed in all sorts of ways and haven't been able to subsidise. And of course, that's a way of putting the onus from the social to the private. So people who can't use a bus service because it's gone have to then buy a car, and they have to kind of spend all that money on buying a car. And, you end up being like in America, where many towns don't have any sort of public service at all. So if you want a job, you have to drive. And that's the situation, I mean, possibly where you live, Peterborough. I mean, that's situation there. I'm sure many people have to drive because there isn't adequate bus service.
Certainly that's something that I observe in a medium-sized city, and one where actually the road infrastructure is quite good. So there's a further kind of encouragement there to use personal transport. But of course, if we track bus deregulation back to the 1980s, that was at a time when owning a car was seen as a sign of success and achievement and being upwardly mobile. And why would anybody want to use a bus?
Yes, Mrs. Thatcher famously used to say, you're a loser if you travel by bus.
That's right. Whereas now with the increasing emphasis on social inclusion, on people being able to get to work, and crucially, of course, on reducing carbon emissions, the bus has an incredibly important role to play. But just like with other forms of public transport, people want a reliable service that turns up when it's supposed to, that is available for most of the day, and is affordable.
Well, the fact that the Tories have actually taken this up and allowed Manchester to take franchise out its buses is, I think, interesting. Now, what Labour needs to do is go a bit further and kind of actually put some money into this, ensure that the legislation is right, be a bit brave, do this right at the beginning of their term of office so that this can bed in quickly, and it will make a difference to a lot of people's lives.
And I think other metro mayors, in particular in England, have been given the powers and at least the opportunity to take forward these kind of franchised and regulated systems. So we may see the return of the bus in a really positive way.
That would be great news, and as you say, good for the environment, good for people getting around, good, of course, for older people who can no longer drive but have a bus pass and so on. So let's hope that Louise Haig's commitment to this is strong and that she will push through these types of changes.
Calling All Stations is going international now because we have a really big civil aviation story from India.
Yes, and it's actually the biggest airline order ever, aircraft order. Air India has ordered 460 planes, about half from Boeing and half from Airbus. So that's very interesting. Air India has actually launched the biggest order ever for aircraft. 460 new planes, split pretty much equally between Airbus and Boeing, who are really the only two major sources of aircraft in the world left. And that's interesting in itself because it shows that they want to keep balance between Europe, which builds Airbus, and we still have a big involvement of that, of course, with big factory making the wings in Wales, and the US, where Boeing, of course, has recovered from its disasters over its new plane, which led to 2 crashes and led to the whole fleet being grounded for more than 2 years. And they're now selling that same aircraft, which I actually flew in once before
Really?
the accident. Yes, I flew. Oddly enough, I took a plane from Casablanca to Paris once, and it was in this brand new 737, not realizing that this aircraft was the dodgy one. Anyway, that's beside the point. And so India is interesting. I mean, first of all, a lot of these planes are for its domestic fleet, and of course India is big enough to fly people around. I've flown on domestic flights in India, but it does show that it's a great rival to the railways in India, where the railways have been the mainstay of domestic travel for a long time, and now face the twin competitions of the roads. Gradually, and I've been to India a couple of years ago, and it's still gradual improvement on the roads. And of course, then the fact that aviation, does get you round between, say, Delhi and Chennai rather more quickly than a train, which takes 24 hours. So, you can see where they're going. India is very much changing rapidly. Actually, it sees China as the example. So it is building some high-speed rail, but it sees China with all its technology and all its development as the one it wants to follow, and it is radically changing before our eyes. So, but what's interesting about this in transport terms, of course, is that it also shows that there is a great post-COVID recovery in aviation, and I think aviation suffered, badly because. If you have got a dangerous disease going around, the last thing you want is to travel in an enclosed space for several hours with people who might have that disease. And so they lost out. They still lost out to some extent. They got bailed out to an enormous extent. But I think this massive order shows great confidence back in aviation.
And I think it's fair to say that we talked in an earlier episode about the myth, if you like, of sustainable aviation fuel and how difficult that will be to realise. But certainly newer planes are going to be less emitting, even using conventional fossil fuels, than older aircraft. So that must be good news. And of course, quite a lot of the engines for these fleets are to be built in the UK. I believe,
absolutely. I mean, Richie Sunak said that something like 450 jobs would be created in the UK thanks to this. Might have been a lot more if we hadn't had Brexit, but we won't go there. So I take your point that yes, the planes will be more fuel efficient, as every model is, but there's no doubting that aviation is, a real no-no in terms of sustainability. And, every flight that will take off, as I suggest, between Chennai and Delhi rather than the plane, rather than the train, is, going to be more greenhouse gases and, more pollution around the airports and so on. So, yes, one can view it as kind of modernisation. I do think that most of all what it's showing is India's ambition to be a sort of big regional power, to emulate China in terms of growth, and also to show that it's wants to be friends with Europe and with the United States. Very interesting, that balancing the orders. So watch this space and see what kind of actually emerges.
Here's Christian's thought from the departure lounge.
Well, Mark, here we go again. We had thought that just possibly, given the state of the finances, we might have got a fuel duty increase. But no, as one of the perennial promises, which has gone on for 15 years now, no fuel duty increase in the budget. And indeed, what's really depressing about this, as a Labour supporter, is that this was also endorsed by Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, who said before the budget that Jeremy Hunt must not kind of tax the motorists more, and therefore they should leave the fuel duty level unchanged. And this is, in the context of a world where we're trying to move towards net zero, we're trying to be more sustainable, we're trying to do kind of all these things. And also we saw that the Tory government has also cut, the figure is unclear, but at least a couple of £100 million from the active travel budget, which I'm sure you know is about getting more people cycling and walking and kind of making junctions safer and all that. And they've cut that, but they have found the money to ensure that they leave fuel duty the same. It's just, there's some aspects sometimes of writing about transport which are really depressing, because this is same old, and we've been here before. We know what the arguments are, and nobody is listening.
Calling All Stations with Christian Wolmar is a Cogitamus Limited production. If you've liked what you've heard, do give us a 5-star rating on whichever podcast platform you use.